Welcome back, everybody, to Voice for Valor. Mike here, and I've got an incredible conversation to share with you today. I recently sat down with John, a Coast Guard veteran whose life story reads like something out of a movie. He started his journey as a young kid in England and ended up becoming one of the most respected helicopter pilots in Coast Guard history. Let me tell you, the rescue stories that John shares in this episode left me speechless. He was part of the team that responded to the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash. Yes, you heard that correct. A moment that changed music history forever. And that's not all. He was also key in a cruise ship rescue where they saved over 500 lives in terrible conditions. These weren't just missions, they were moments where ordinary people became extraordinary. What I love about John's perspective is how real he gets about the weight of these rescues. He talks openly about making split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance, and how he also balanced being brave while staying compassionate when people were at their most vulnerable. This episode isn't just about heroic rescues. John opens up about the toll his service took on his mental health over the years. He shares his journey of realizing it's okay to ask for help, something I know many of us veterans struggle with. Throughout our conversation, John comes back to the importance of teamwork and what real leadership looks like when the stakes are highest. Even now, years after hanging up his uniform, he's still committed to mentoring others and passing on what he's learned. Whether you're someone who loves hearing about daring rescues, or you're looking for wisdom about leadership and bouncing back from tough times, I promise you, John's story has something valuable for you. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and join me for this powerful conversation with a true hero who never lost his humanity along the way. Let's dive in. It has been an unbelievably busy time. I'm 2 weeks from retirement, and I'm so thankful to have these problems of being so busy. So setting up private consulting, just recently got a job with George Mason University, a large local institution here in the greater DC area. Sure. I'm working some private equity deals. I'm very busy, and it's because of the power of the network, the power of the friendships. And I'm truly blessed and thankful for all these opportunities I've had. But my goodness,
Amen.
I will be I'm going to be busy till 9:30 tonight, from 6:30 this morning to 9:30 tonight,
That's a good thing.
Which is good. No, it is. It's great. Time flies, and it's things that I enjoy. I'm completely satisfied with what I'm doing. So that just makes the time just fly by.
Good. All right. Well, I'm ready when you're ready.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for joining us today. I must say, you've got to be, if not the most interesting person, one of the most interesting people I've ever met on an airplane. I'm literally sitting one row in front of you, and you turn to my wife and I, and you say, "Hey, what's that hat you're wearing?" And I had my Voice for Valor hat on. We started talking about podcasts. We started talking about service. And here we are. You've been on multiple podcasts, and I'm fascinated with your story. And I'm so thankful that we had a chance to meet on that fateful day back in Alaska. I don't know, 6 months ago or so.
Yeah, there was what a divine opportunity that was. I just and I noticed when you got on the plane with a hat, I didn't want to say anything because how it is on airplanes. I just want to talk to strangers. They don't want to talk to you. But I just something that said maybe just turn around, acknowledge your hat, and here we are.
Yeah. And so for the listeners out there, John mentioned a couple podcasts that he was on, and I listened to one of them, who's a rescue swimmer up in the Alaska area, and he's got hundreds of episodes online. I can share that with the team if anybody wants to listen in. But when I listened to your story, I thought, man, I've got to interview John for hopefully my sphere of influence can hear your inspirational stories and share those with others. So how's it going? Are you ready to start?
I'm ready to start. Just Jason Quinn, if I can say his name, Jason Quinn, the Real Rescue podcast was a fun one to do because we covered things I did that, were got all kinds of awards and recognition. Some other things that like I had to hang my head in shame because it didn't work out quite right. So I covered everything. The other two podcasts, they were a little bit more tame than that. So I could go any direction you want. It's a family audience,
Well,
so I'll
it
be
was
careful.
yeah, well, we're all about inspiration here.
Hmm.
So the
Yeah.
thing I wanted to ask you first was your journey from being a young boy in
Hmm.
England
Hmm.
and watching your father serve in the Royal Navy Fleet, the air arm of the Royal Navy Fleet. How did that, how did following your father's footsteps and pursuing that military aviation in America, what motivated you for that path?
Well, I didn't give you the full story when I gave my bio. My dad actually died on active duty. So we were stationed in Malta when I was just really little. And believe it or not, he died from polio. And in Malta, right in Malta. So we moved back. And it obviously changed the trajectory of our lives at that point. And, uh, back in those days, in the early 50s, uh, my mom was pregnant with my brother. A single mom didn't have the support network that you see today, whether a military support network, which she should have had, which she didn't really exist, or just a local friends neighborhood network. So ultimately, she she came back for a couple of years, and then she actually went away. Believe it or not, she went to sea. She worked on the Cunard lines. Back those days, the ships going between Southampton and New York were transportation. They weren't cruise ships. That was how you got from America to the continent or vice versa. And so we lived with my aunt and uncle for a number of years, and then we went to boarding school. So my brother and I were in boarding school for a number of years. So that actually really shaped us, and I think in some ways for the good. So my mom remarried to another English guy, wonderful guy. He was my stepfather, wonderful, wonderful guy. Um, and they moved to America, and they were essentially, well, they talk about immigration. They moved to America, and they were servants. They were household servants. My mom was a cook and a housekeeper. My dad was the butler and chauffeur. So they they eventually brought us over to America, and we didn't want to leave. At that point we had been gone. They'd been gone for a couple of years. My brother and I didn't want to come to America. You would think you would, but we didn't. We had our friends, our family, and everything was there. But we came and ended up graduating from high school and went to college, and then then joined the Coast Guard. So that's kind of how that all happened. So the things that you said, what kind of shaped my career. I think one thing that is a common theme I find throughout my life from way back then. Two things. One common themes is that one is don't ever give up. And I can think of so many times where if I had just caved in or just said this is too hard or I can't figure a way out, my life would have changed. And for some reason or other, I've always just hung in there and kept on going. It's true on that rescue in Sitka. We could have given up and just packed it in and come home. It's true in other ways, and I always tell this story to people because I think this is another life story that I it doesn't come up in podcasts, but I think it pertains to your particular, I think, background here. Is that when I went to, because I played soccer my whole life, in England, football, played soccer growing up, and then came to this country and played soccer and started the soccer team at my high school. We didn't have one, and then I went to school. I went to San Diego State. It was a Division I team. And I went down, then I was walked on to play soccer. And I tried out for a couple of weeks, and I was really, really good in high school. I did great in high school. But then they start to, the skill levels get higher, and they start to refine the teams down. So I was there for like 3 weeks, and the coach came over to me one day and said, I don't think you're going to make it. And so I looked, and I said, well, his name, and you talked about, his name was George Logan, Scottish guy. Another great guy, somebody that had an influence on my life. But I told him, I said, Coach, I didn't come all the way down here from the Bay Area where we were living to San Diego to play recreational soccer. I said, I came down to play for you. So he said, okay. It was one of those things. I could have just said, okay, whatever. I'll go play, co-ed soccer. I didn't want to do that. And so I played. And then within about 3 weeks, he said, okay, I want you to be the captain of the team. So that's sort of my don't give up message. Don't give up. If you've got a goal, if you've got a dream, do whatever you need to do to achieve that. And if you get roadblocks, find a way around it or over. So that's sort of an introduction to that. And actually, I applied to the Coast Guard Academy, finishing high school. I applied to the Coast Guard Academy, and people always, well, how did you find out about the Coast Guard? It was literally this. I was in a chemistry class with my buddy Ernie Smith, and neither one of us were good at chemistry. We were terrible. So there was an announcement on the PA that I owe my Coast Guard career to chemistry. So the PA said, hey, there's a Coast Guard recruiter. And at this time, it's like 1970-ish, something like that. So Vietnam was still going on. So just the notion of joining any military organization was sort of frowned on. But I've always wanted to be in the military, always wanted to be a helicopter pilot from the time I was little. So I looked at him, he looked at me. We weren't connecting on the periodic table in any way. So we just said, hey, let's go. So I went to the Coast Guard recruiter, ended up applying for the academy. My friend Ernie joined the Navy, went to the AOC program and flew P3s. So that's how I got in. And I didn't get into the academy, I should say. I was an alternate candidate, but I also wasn't a citizen. So that wouldn't have worked. So I had to become 18 to become a citizen. So then I went to college and went through OCS after I graduated. But again, I think don't give up. The academy didn't work out. Probably good for me it didn't in some ways. And then finished high school, college, and went to officer candidate school in Yorktown, Virginia.
I want to hit that Vietnam piece, but what you just mentioned made me realize I've interviewed quite a few people, quite a few successful service members, and they seem to have a recurring theme of athletics. Mm-hmm. I think athletics is so important in developing that resilience that you're describing through soccer. My youngest son is a smaller, skinny kid, mm-hmm. and we kind of forced him into basketball. And now he's finally to that stage where he's really building that confidence and excelling far beyond he would have ever imagined. And I hope that one day when he's, 18 years old, or he's, facing a tough decision where people are telling him no, hopefully he leans back on that, on the sports and that experience. Sure. And so what do you think about sports? Do you think more kids should be playing sports? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's always benefits to everything. Some kids just will never be sports kids, and that's fine. And then they shouldn't be ostracized in any way for not being, especially once you get to middle school, high school. But sports is a great outlet, and for me, and it's one of the there's two recurring themes. One is don't give up, and the other one is, and I say this with no arrogance or anything else, but I always seem to float to the top, to the leadership pile. Without sometimes not even trying. Like I went down to San Diego State, and said from going from don't play to would you be the captain of the team, and I certainly didn't ask for that. It just came along. It's same thing when I was in high school, the soccer team. I just ended up being elevated, and then it went on all throughout my life. It's just so, to your point, it gives you leadership experience. Even if you're not the team leader, but it gives you an opportunity to practice leadership, to practice teamwork, to figure out how to play and work with others. Because I played on teams where you had people that weren't good team players, and it didn't matter how good they were. Ultimately, they were never successful.
Yeah, there's a book out there, the five dysfunctions of a team, mm-hmm. and it really talks about no matter how good you are as a star player, if you're not coming together with the team, mm-hmm. you're not going to succeed.
Right.
So, well, thank you for that. Now I wanted to ask a question. In one of your previous podcasts, you talked about Vietnam mm-hmm. and your early career, mm-hmm. the folks you flew with. Can you describe some of that Vietnam pilot experience that you garnered?
Yeah, and it's only been lately since I've had a chance to talk on these podcasts that I actually changed the terminology. But when I finished, I went to Pensacola, Navy Flight School in Pensacola, and got my wings, and then went to Mobile, where the Coast Guard has the aviation training center. And I went to, for us, it was advanced helo training. So I went from flying Hueys and Jet Rangers to flying H-3s or S-61s, H-3s, the amphibious helicopter. And then I went to New Orleans. And it was lovely. I got there in 1976. So Vietnam would have been over a couple of years. And the Coast Guard, because they were short pilots, ultimately brought just a cadre of Vietnam pilots in, was Navy, Marine Corps, um, and Army, particularly Army. I don't remember any Air Force guys, but the greatest thing is coming out. As you know, when you first come out of flight school, you've got 250 hours or whatever it is you have, and you're all excited as you got your wings, but you know absolutely nothing. You don't want to be left alone in a plane because you're dangerous. And what I found was that these guys, virtually every one of them had been in combat in some way or another. In fact, one of the guy that was my stick mate in Mobile had been shot down 7 times. Had his transmission shot out, had been crash landed on helipads and LZs, and these guys were just phenomenal pilots. So my first couple of years in New Orleans as a brand new pilot, what I always consider it was my apprenticeship in aviation, because I went from, we got 250 hours. I've got a naval aviator designation, but I really don't know anything. And they trained me in my craft in such a way that I always felt that people after me were disadvantaged because they didn't have that depth of experience, the coolness under fire. I remember one time we went out to do an aids to navigation mission where we're just working on a light at the very end of the Mississippi River. There's a big long jetty that goes out there. So if you're facing south, you're looking towards Venezuela, but you can't see it. There's nothing but ocean out there. So there's no physical reference. So you're trying to hover over moving ocean. It's kind of tough because it's one thing if you're over a runway and you can see a spot down beneath you, but when you've got waves going by, it's really hard to stay in one spot within a foot or two. So this other guy I was flying was a Chinook pilot. He was an Army pilot, and he was I think like my aviation god. This guy could fly the heck out of an airplane. So he was flying over there in the right seat, and he says, "Johnny, you want to give it a try?" So sure, I was still brand new, and back in those days was smoking, and so he gave me the controls, and I think I probably went like 10 feet left, 10 feet right, forwards, backwards, and I wasn't even in close because I was looking at moving waves. I couldn't tell. So then he just waited a minute or two, and then he just said, "Johnny, Johnny, Johnny, Johnny," and he smoking his cigarette, and he just grabbed the cyclic and the collective, and it went from being all over the place to just rock steady. And I just looked at that guy and said, I want to be just like him without the cigarettes.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I recently interviewed another Army helicopter pilot, and he was a Chinook pilot, and he was talking about some of their missions, and I can't even imagine what it was like in Vietnam. I also do a lot of photography,
Mm-hmm.
and I was asked to photograph the American Valor conference
Mm-hmm.
over Veterans Day,
Mm-hmm.
and the surviving team members from Hal Moore's platoon, the book We Were Soldiers Once and
Mm-hmm.
Young, all the survivors from his team were there at the conference.
Oh,
and
cool.
It was just so inspirational to see these guys and hear their stories of what it was like to be one of those first helicopter flights that came in and landed in Vietnam. So throughout your career, John, you've demonstrated obviously incredible courage while also showing deep care for your crew and those that you rescued. How do you cultivate both bravery and compassion as a core leadership trait?
That's an interesting question because I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. But the Coast Guard's mission is search and rescue, multiple missions, but it's really saving life at sea, whether it's an aircraft or whether it's a boat. So that's just built into us, but we train for it all the time. And it's not always as altruistic as that. Sometimes it's like you run over somebody to get in the helicopter and the alarm gets off because you want to be the first one out there, not because you really, I don't want to say you don't care about the person being rescued, you just want to be the one to do the rescuing. So there's a lot of thrill, adrenaline that goes into it as well. But I think that what really attracted me to the Coast Guard was the fact that you do save lives. You do all the practicing, you do all the training, because it's like all the other high level military organizations. The Coast Guard over the water is probably the elite helicopter organization in the world. You've got other guys. The Army has special ops, and the Air Force does their thing, and then the Navy has their thing. But in terms of being able to hover at night over a moving target, the Coast Guard is absolutely the best. So you got the training, and then for me personally, it's just maybe it's just who I am. It's just caring about people, and just making sure that you're um, willing to just do what it takes to rescue somebody who's in distress. And I've rescued everything from dogs to people who had missing body parts, and people who were barely hanging on, people who were lost at sea, and we found them just a head bobbing up and down. And there's just that thrill that goes with it, truthfully, of being successful, knowing you accomplished a mission. And I remember one time we got called out. I was in Astoria, Oregon, and got called about 3 o'clock in the morning, and a boat sank. So it was still dark. It was just getting light by the time we got down there. We're about 90 miles off the shore of Newport, Oregon, and there were 4 guys, one in a life raft and 3 hanging on. And we picked them up, took them back to Newport, and they all got out, climbed in the back of the truck, and just drove away. Not even a handshake or a thank you or a wave or whatever it was. And I remember thinking, well, that seemed kind of rude. At least wave. But you know what? That's what we're there for. That's what we do. And there's nobody that would argue with it.
In those cold temperatures of Oregon waters, if you hadn't found them, what would be a typical survivor rate? Or like how much time could you see somebody surviving out there in those cold northern Pacific waters if you hadn't found them so early?
Well, they did have survival suits on, which helped them. I mean, they could probably last a couple of days, depending on the condition of survival suits and if they'd been injured when they went in. One guy was in the life raft, but 90 miles offshore is a long way, and you've got the Humboldt current, the Japanese current going right by this. So there's no telling where they would have ended up. So, we definitely saved their lives, certainly made them more comfortable. And, if they hadn't been found, with a good chance they could have lasted 3 or 4 days, maybe, without, depending.
And not even a thank you.
Not even a thank you. But I contrast that with some other people we've rescued. I still stay in touch with them today. So, yes, you get the good ones and you get the ones that aren't as good.
Wow. Well, can you share with us your first rescue mission as an aircraft commander when you were down there in the New Orleans area?
Sure. This was actually a night rescue, and it just happened to be my first mission as the aircraft commander, PIC. And so I was actually I wasn't even at base. I was actually in a night school class. Got a call, hey, you need to come back in. There's been a plane crash. And this was October 1977. There's been a plane crash up near Jackson, Mississippi. So, just the thrill of the moment. Let's get going. Let's launch. Let's go. So I climbed in the right seat, the pilot seat, and we took off up into the night, climbed over New Orleans up towards somewhere that just basically turned out to be a wooded area just about 15 miles south of Jackson, Mississippi. And when we got there, there was just all kinds of activity. There were planes circling overhead from the Coast Guard in Mobile. There were helicopters from Mobile. But we were the only one that had what we call a night sun. It's this humongous multi-candle, million-candle powered light to illuminate the air. So we just hovered over the trees. I didn't know what was going on other than I knew it was a plane crash. So hovering over the trees, and you could see activity down there, just barely see activity. It's a really heavily wooded area. And what had happened is this plane had been flying from South Carolina was on its way to Shreveport, and it had a world famous rock band on board. And so everybody was trying to pull baby out of the trees, and we hovered over these trees for about an hour or so. Then they said, hey, go ahead and land. There's a field. So I just sidestepped to the right and landed in the field, and they start loading people up in the back of the plane. And as they were loading up, they said, oh yeah, this is the Lynyrd Skynyrd band. I said, oh, I knew who Lynyrd Skynyrd was. I had no idea. It's the Lynyrd Skynyrd guys. So we had 3 or 4 badly injured guys in the back. So we just piled them in, took them up to Jackson, Mississippi, and to the hospital, landed at the hospital helipad and dropped them off. And so that was my first night rescue, was to rescue 3 or 4 of the Lynyrd Skynyrd band members.
Unbelievable. I mean, I know you've shared that story with me before, and I mentioned to you in the past, I can't even imagine. Here it's essentially your dollar ride as the guy in charge, and you go to this crash, and such a cult following in the military of the Lynyrd Skynyrd band, and here you are having an opportunity to once again save lives. So I have to ask, have you had an opportunity to reach out to any of these family members or bandmates and have this share this story, share this discussion?
No, I actually really haven't. In fact, I was talking about it. Had I, been a little bit more quick-witted, I probably would have said, "Hey, can I get an autograph or something?" But I don't really think they were in the mood for that. They're all bandaged up and banged up, so probably wasn't the right time. No, I've never really reached out to them. It'd be kind of fun to just connect and say, "Hey, I was there back in 1977, and we were really glad to be able to help you guys." And the fun thing about rescuing people, and I'll probably talk about another rescue here in a minute, is it's great. You got the thrill of the rescue, but then what happens to those people after you rescue them? What happens to their lives? And so Lynyrd Skynyrd guys, there were 5 people killed, and I should just, for those that don't know what happened, it was a Convair 580 that took off from Greenville, South Carolina, on the route to Shreveport to do a concert. And I don't even know how you figure this out, because that Convair 580 has like a 1,200-mile fuel range, and it's only at 500 miles. They ran out of fuel. I don't even. It was a pilot. I didn't even. That's incomprehensible to me. But so they ran out of fuel and crashed into this heavily wooded area. They were trying to make the field, I think, that I landed in, but they didn't. So they crashed into the woods, and the aircraft was just demolished, and the wings in places and the fuselage in places and whatnot. So 5 people were killed: the 2 pilots, Ronnie Van Zant, his girlfriend, and the band manager were killed. So 5 people died, but the rest of them made it. And thank God for that.
Well, once you shared that story with me, I started reaching out to some of my friends, and a few of my friends are affiliated with Guitars for Vets.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the name of the organization. And so when I shared this story, they said that they were going to reach out to Lynyrd Skynyrd Band because they've done events with them in the past. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you live in Alaska now. And I said, if there's a way that we can line this up on their next Alaska visit, if we can get John, whether that's a backstage pass or some opportunity to just say hello to the band, I'm sure they would be just unbelievably happy to meet somebody that was part of that mission on that fateful night.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Well, we will do our best to make it happen, because like I said, I do have some friends in high places, and I think that would be just such a neat experience for everyone involved, for you to be able to do.
And I can say this for all the coasties, that I know, that nobody ever does this for any kind of a payback. That's just not who we are. And just like every rescue I've been on, it just happened to be my day. I had the duty that day, or I got called in. They don't say, well, let's go down the list and pick the best guy here. Everybody's equally capable, and it's just your turn in the barrel. It just happened to be my day. And I also had, I won't even go into it, but I had my first offshore night SAR rescue was less successful than that. Ultimately we rescued the guy, but I won't go into the details. It was actually in the Jason Quinn rescue, but things didn't go as well as I'd like. So you got the good ones, and you got the ones that didn't go so well.
So now that you mentioned Jason, and you were talking about one of your other rescues, mm-hmm. This other rescue is the largest or the most folks saved. Please share.
Yeah. So I went from New Orleans to Kodiak, and was involved in numerous rescues in Kodiak. It's just back in those days. It was 1979, 1980, and the fishing industry in those days was not as well prepared as they are today. Prepared in terms of vessel inspections, the Coast Guard does survival suits, which keep them from getting hypothermia, EPIRBs, electronic position indicating beacons. So the industry has really, really improved. But in those days, there were just one after another tragic losses of boats. Well, this one was a cruise ship that was transiting from Japan, repositioning to probably to Canada because of the Jones Act. So about 120 miles offshore of Yakutat, so about 120 miles offshore, the engine room caught fire. And this was the motor vessel cruise ship Princeton, Holland American cruise ship. They had 522 passengers and crew on board. And one of the engine room's engines caught fire. They shut it down, and just as luck would have it, that was the one that ran the pumps. So they were a mess. So they started flooding because they were trying to put the fires out. And ultimately, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, all 522 people abandoned ship into lifeboats, and the lifeboats weren't motorized; they were just unpowered. So I had the duty that night. Got a call about 3 o'clock in the morning, just like one of those days. It was my turn, and flew up to Valdez first, then Valdez to Yakutat. I refueled and then went offshore. And just when I got out there, there were 3 helos from Sitka, Coast Guard Air Station Sitka. But I was the first helo from Kodiak. There were 2 or 3 helos from the 442 Squadron, which is a Royal Canadian Forces rescue squadron based in Comox, BC. They were there, and they had the Labradors. And then there were C-130, Coast Guard C-130s overhead. There were Canadian Buffaloes, which the fixed wing were overhead. So it was just like there were planes everywhere. I mean, it was like World War II. It was like buzzing around, and it was low vis, quarter-mile of fog, 15-foot seas maybe. And I just remember getting out there and just use lifeboats everywhere. I mean, so basically you just go pick a lifeboat. So went over to a lifeboat, started hauling people out, and filled up the back. And then there just so happened to be a tanker. There was the tanker Williamsburg that was en route from Valdez to Southern California. I went and landed on this tanker and just dropped all these people off on the tanker, and then went back again and started picking people up. And by now we were getting low on fuel because it's a couple hours round trip. Getting low on fuel. We had about 10 people in the back, and there were still people in the lifeboat we were hoisting from. There were 19 people total. Because as the story was ultimately told, that was the lifeboat that I hoisted from was ultimately those people were left overnight. That was the only lifeboat that didn't get completely rescued, and there were 2 Air Force PJs on it. The Air Force dropped people off, and they did the PJ drop. And anyway, but one of the interesting stories on this is as we were hoisting these people out, and they were all older folks. They all had they weren't dressed, and they had night clothes on. They had pajamas and whatnot, dressing gowns on. And one old lady got in the basket, and just as we were about to lift her off, it fell off the back of this boat, the transom. It just got knocked through a wave, and she got dragged through a wave. She got dumped. Oh. So anyway, we got her up. She came in, and I remember looking over my shoulder, and there was one lady sitting on the life raft, and she was just drenched, but she was busily putting on makeup, doing her lipstick. I remember seeing this, and it's just like, whatever's important.
Priorities.
You got to get your priorities straight. And then everybody was just wet and cold, and there was actually one guy in the back passed out from hypothermia. We eventually landed in Yakutat, and we were disembarking everybody. And this one old lady, it turned out to be the one that got dunked. I was helping her down the ladder, and there was all these camera crews there, and they came running over to her, and they said to her, "Well, ma'am, could you, what happened? Tell us what it was like." And so I was helping her down. I was still holding her hand when she said this. She goes, "Well, you know what? I'm 86 years old, and they dunked me. I'm too old for this shit." And so I let go of her hand, and she walked away.
86 years old. When you were describing the story, I was thinking to myself, my goodness, with all those aircraft, all those helicopters, low visibility, there were no mid-air collisions. Everybody was safe.
It was close. Yeah, there was actually a really close mid-air between a C-130 and a Labrador, Canadian Labrador. I mean, they were so close that as I remember talking to the C-130 AC, he basically just pulled the yoke back as hard as he could, gave it all the power he could, and just did an alley-oop over this Labrador. I mean, it was probably within a couple hundred yards, really close.
These historical rescue missions, do they have any sort of reunions or anything like that to invite back the service members that were part of that rescue?
This one did. It's still called the Princendam was the name of the boat, the Princendam Rescue Association, and we've been to a couple of them, and they're still talking about it. Of course, it's now 45 years later, so a lot of the people are getting a little bit old. So, but it was the reason that, again, this was a significant rescue, and I got a DFC, and all my crews and the other crews got DFCs. The reason it was so significant is because it was, to this day, the largest successful maritime rescue in history in the world, because nobody died. All 522 were saved, and somebody got dunked. In fact, when I went back to Go back to Kodiak 2 days later, because I was, when I landed, I was bagged out. I couldn't find him. I had too much. I had 10 hours on, and I had to wait a day before I could fly back. And when I got back, in the maintenance crew in the hangar there, my maintenance crew, God bless them, they put this huge banner up that said 521 saved, one dumped. So they didn't miss a beat.
Oh, that's a very exciting story. Yeah. No fatalities, and an old lady giving you grief.
Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Distinguished Flying Cross. For our listeners out there that aren't familiar, that's essentially the most prestigious flying award that you can receive. And not only did you and your crewmates receive these Distinguished Flying Crosses, but you're also now part of an organization that is continuing this legacy. Please share.
Well, I've got one more DFC story I'll tell you. Maybe I could, if I'll just get to that, then I'll kind of wrap it all together. It'll make sense. So from Kodiak, we went to Astoria, then Astoria to Sitka, Alaska, and there I was the head of aircraft maintenance, which is promotion, and it was a specific job title. I was in charge of all the helo maintenance and all the crew. Well, on December 10th, 1987, I got called out on a case, and it was about 7:00 at night. The alarm goes off, and they say there's a boat sinking near Sitka. So this is December, it's just nighttime. So we launched out, and as soon as we took off, I climbed 500 feet. And this, for people that are flying today or just recently retired, there's no GPS, there's no NVGs, there's none of that stuff. It's, we had basics, had VOR, had TACAN kind of stuff, but none of the tools and techniques they have today. So, taking off and flying maybe 2 minutes. Plus, flying into Alaska, there's no other lights. It's pitch black. It's just black, black, black. So you're just relying strictly on radar and relying on, in our case, this was the TACAN DME. And all of a sudden, the radar quit, and every piece of nav grid quit. And I looked at the window, and we iced up. We're at 500 feet, completely iced over. So I dropped down to about 300 feet and tried to shed the ice, get a little bit warmer. And so eventually the radar came back on, we're flying back up to 500 feet. And we could hear this guy calling Mayday, but we couldn't see him because just low vis, it was snowing, just blizzard. I mean, it went from nothing when we were on base to all of a sudden this blizzard came out of nowhere. And we couldn't see anything. So I asked my co-pilot to say, hey, just get on the radio, just call this guy, have him count down from 10 to 1 backwards, and we'll do a radio point, ADF point. So we did, and we got a needle point, swung over that way, got over there, and there's this little boat, and the thing was 26 feet long. I mean, just think about that. That's like the size of most people's pleasure boats. And it was a commercial fishing boat, so there was literally no room on deck to put the rescue basket. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't. So we got over the top of this guy, and by the time we got there, the winds were gusting to 70 knots, over 70 knots, and the seas were 35 feet. They were just monstrous. And this little boat...
And it's dark. And it's totally dark.
It's nighttime. It's a blizzard condition. So pulled into a 50-foot hover that was almost impossible to maintain, just like back in the early discussion, when you've got a fixed reference point, hovering at night's no big deal. But when you've got waves going by at 35 knots and but 70 knots, it's really kind of hard. So, but we stayed. And from the pilot's perspective, when you start to hoist over somebody, the boat goes behind us, so I can't see it. When he's in front of me, I can see it. But hovering over this guy, and literally just out of nowhere, the nose of the helicopter just pitched up about 15 degrees, and we were at 50 feet to begin with, and we start going backwards, and we're going backwards at 50 and 60 knots, and down, backwards and down. And I mean, it seemed like an eternity. We're going backwards and down, pulled full power. All the torque gauges were redlining, the engines were redlining. I had full forward cyclic. Nothing was happening. Nothing. Wasn't responding, and we're still going backwards and down. And my co-pilot, who went on to be a Alaska Airlines pilot, he looked at me and I looked at him. Well, we didn't say anything. But we both knew that, hey, this is it. We're going in. We're going to die. I mean, there was no panic. It was just like, hey, we're going in. And then just after that, when if you sit at your desk and somebody comes behind you kind of quietly and you don't hear them, and they lean over you, you can feel their presence. Well,
Hmm.
in that particular helicopter, the crew could walk up into the cockpit, not like the 860, but the H3, you could walk into the cockpit. So I felt what I thought was my flight mechanic in the back, my hoist operator, leaning over my shoulder, probably wondering what the heck is he doing up here. And and it was so real. I turned around, told him to sit down because hey, sit down, we're going to crash. And he said, hey, I'm not up here. It was such a real presence. And as soon as that presence happened, we stopped and it shuddered, stopped, and we were at 15 feet with 15 degrees nose up, which means the tail was probably within a foot or two of hitting the water. And we just came to a shuddering halt. And I remember looking at the airspeed indicator and a 15-foot hover, and it was 55 knots. So we motored on back, got over the boat. That same thing happened 3 times, by the way, during this rescue. So we motored back up, got over this guy, and just realized that there was just no way we could get the basket down to him. It just wasn't enough room on that thing, that back deck, a tiny little boat. So we just told him, and we didn't know who it was at the time. We just said, "Hey, Skipper, you're gonna have to jump overboard. He's had his survival suit on, jump overboard, and then get away from the boat so we can rescue you." So he did, and it turned out it was a fisherman and his 6-year-old son, and he strapped his son to his chest and jumped overboard, and we still couldn't get the basket to him because the boat was still right there, and it eventually sank. It just went stern down, and the bow came up, and it just went underwater. But we still couldn't get to him. So I said to my rescue swimmer, and the thing that makes this whole thing significant is the Coast Guard had never used a rescue swimmer ever in nighttime at sea conditions. The program was brand new in 1987. So we end up being using the first deployment of rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard history at sea at night conditions. So anyway, I asked my rescue swimmer, his name's Jeff. I said, Jeff, I said, we can't rescue these guys unless you're willing to go. And he says, put me in, sir. So strapped him on. He put him out the door on a sling. And as soon as his fins hit the water, we started going backwards again. And he just punched out because we just started dragging backwards. And before I put him in, I told my crew, I said, I don't care what happens to the fisherman. I didn't know it was a 6-year-old boy, but I said, I don't care. We're not losing our rescue swimmer. We're not going to lose. I said, everybody train your eyes, the lights, everything. Don't divert from that. So I could see Jeff, the swimmer, spinning in circles because he was separated by 35-foot seas, and there was just howling winds and snow. He didn't know where to go because he was disoriented. So I did what I told him not to do, is I moved the searchlight because I can see the reflective tape of their survival suits in front of me. I moved it over and pointed it at them. He somehow knew to follow that beam of light. I mean, it's really kind of miraculous. Followed that beam of light over about 4 just gigantic waves, and it came up upon him. And to his surprise, it was a fisherman and his 6-year-old son. And again, this was the first time that, even though he trained, it's the first time that ever really happened. And so the fisherman said, "Hey, who are you?" He said, well, "I'm a rescue swimmer. I'm here to get you out." And the fisherman, this is the best part of the whole story. The fisherman said, "Well, do you think they can rescue us?" And he said, and so Jeff said, "No problem. We do this shit all the time." And it was his first time ever, and just good for him. I mean, it's just that story has been told over and over, but I mean, that just gives you just an indication of how well trained, how motivated those guys are. It's just, it was miraculous, but it was training, crew coordination. So anyway, we tried and still couldn't get them. So they couldn't stay over the target. Those 50, 60 knot winds were just blowing the basket and the heel all over the place. And I remember asking my crew, I said, "Hey, we've been at this for 45 minutes. I said, we almost crashed 4 times. I said, there's nobody else coming to get us. There's no other helos anywhere near. There's the only one back at the station was broken. So, if we go in, this is it." I said, and nobody's going to come get us. We're going to lose these guys. So what if we throw the life raft out and let them ride it out for the night? So I'd heard people, back in the days, I heard that was a technique that had been used. And thank goodness nobody said anything. So I said, okay, let's go give it another try. So again, don't give up. I went back, and with the second try, we got the 2 fishermen and his son, and then I put the basket back down again for Jeff. And as soon as he got in the basket, we just got knocked backwards again. And we were dragging him through these waves at 50 miles an hour. And I could see him in front of me now because we're dragging him. And he hit the crest of these waves 3 times. There's huge explosion of water. Just boom, boom, boom. And the helicopter shuddered on the 3rd one. and the guy in the back saying, "You killed him, you killed him, you killed him." It's like not anything you ever want to hear. And Jeff came swinging up. I mean, he came swinging so close to the tail rotor that the guys in the back were doing everything they could to keep that cable, the hoist cable, from going up into the tail rotor, and finally got it settled down, brought him in, and he lost his mask and his snorkel got wiped out in those crashes. And he came back and threw up a couple times, gave us this thumbs up, and he was okay. And we went back in and landed, and it was, I mean, we all knew that we'd done something that nobody ever done before. And it was really a momentous event. And I'm happy to say I did $500,000 worth of damage to the helicopter. You know, they had to replace the transmission as a hoist assembly, and they had to repair all kinds of stress damage to the tail pylon. So that helo was out of commission for like 2 or 3 months afterwards. But then we went on, and you know, when I got back, the command said, "Hey, that was a great rescue. We're going to put you in for a DFC." And I said, "Don't put me in for a DFC unless you're going to put the whole crew in." I said, "I don't want it." So the rescue swimmer got the first DFC in Coast Guard history for doing a rescue, and the rest of the crew got DFCs too. And then we went on the award circuit forever after that. And that kind of fast forward to maybe a DFC story is that we were at an award ceremony in Lake City, Florida, and Jeff and I had been selected to go, and it was the EAA, Experimental Aircraft Association, Sun and Fun Flying, and we were supposedly the VIPs. So we were supposedly, the guys that were the, I guess, VIPs. And I never felt like a VIP. It was fun to go because I'd never been there. But I remember looking in the corner of this big, huge tent. There were these 2 old guys sitting there, and something that just kind of like me talking to you about your hat. I said, I just need to go talk to these guys. And as it turned out, these 2 old guys were the pilot and co-pilot of the Memphis Belle.
Oh my gosh!
Bob Morgan.
At Sun and Fun?
Yeah, Bob Morgan and Jim Verinis. I got their autographs. Unlike Lynyrd Skynyrd, I got these guys' autographs. And and here we are saying, "Oh, you guys are the VIPs, going to give a speech." I said, "How can I say anything when I'm looking at these 2 guys who are just legends? These guys are heroes. These are guys that I've read about." So I didn't feel so significant at that point. But what it did do further on is when I was asked to be now the board chair of the Distinguished Flying Cross Committee, I thought, what is my role here? My role is really to help preserve, teach, and promote the history, the legacy of guys like Bob Morgan and Jim Verinis on the Memphis Belle. And I've since, now that I'm part of this organization, I've run into guys who have 7 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Well, that's the cost of entry. You have to have a Distinguished Flying Cross. But one guy that I met just not too long ago got 3 DFCs in 1 week in Vietnam on the back of a carrier flying A4s. And there's just more recently, just in the last week or 2, there was a crew in Florida. I forget in southern Florida, the one that's close, Eglin.
Yeah, the MacDill
guys that just got an award for working on the refueling a tanker crew. And there's another tanker crew in Knoxville, and there's a crew in Seymour Johnson in March that's all getting DFC. So you get to meet these guys and talk to people who've just done amazing things at a moment in time. And there's not one of them that I've run into that said, "Well, I'm special, and that's why I go to DFC." No, you're just an ordinary guy doing your job to the best of your ability, and you happen to be in that right place in the right time. And to come back to your original theme, the thing that I've really found fascinating is, okay, you got your award, you move on with your life, you eventually get out of the service, then what? What do you do? And some of the people I've run into, including yourself now, take that military career and leverage it into some really remarkable achievements. Some people by the virtue of the pay grade or the level they move, they retire at, they go on to corporate jobs just because of connections. But the people I've been really impressed with are the ones that have created things through their training, through their abilities, through their connections. And I haven't run into anybody yet who didn't do remarkable things. And maybe it's all connected, just to, as a pilot, by the time you get selected into the military, then you go through flight school, you finish, and then you go up to the various co-pilot, first pilot, aircraft commander, and you go through the different levels. I mean, you're constantly being filtered, because not everybody makes it to the top. And so I think for the most part, the pilots across the military, by the time you reach the pinnacle of your careers, I mean, you're a highly trained, highly motivated individual, not like anybody else. And thank goodness for that.
I tell my wife all the time, she jokes around, she says, here he is on his recruiting pitch again. But any kid that I have a chance to talk to that has questions about where they want their path or where they want their life to go, I am always telling them military service is the greatest thing that I have ever had an opportunity to participate in, because we develop such a tight-knit group that you and I have completely different backgrounds, from completely different decades, from completely different services, but we have a connection whether people realize it or not.
Absolutely.
And so I just keep trying to tell people it is so important to live a purpose-driven life and to support others. You being a Coast Guard guy, you'll get my metaphor. I tell people all the time, rising tides lift all boats. Let's all bring everyone up together and let's succeed together. And it's just been such an amazing experience. And I would be more than happy to introduce you to some of my DFC friends from the younger generation. I think I shared with you he was a load master for me when I was flying C-17s out of McCord. And so he was enlisted, and then he went to officer training school, became a C-17 pilot, and he got a DFC for being one of the C-17s during the initial day of the evacuation of Afghanistan.
Oh, wow. I'd love to meet him. And it's,
yeah,
and I just want to say
fresh
this.
Blood.
I just want to say this. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but as I was saying all these great things about military people, it doesn't mean we're better than anybody else. It doesn't mean anything other than the fact that you can look at somebody's the career path they've chosen, how they've used the opportunities they've been given. Because not everybody does this. Not everybody succeeds in the military, but the ones that make it out the end and with distinction, I mean, you could, like you say, you could pick one up, put in the Air Force or the Coast Guard or the Navy or whatever it is. It's a personality character type that I think is just bred for success. And you don't think about this when you first get in the military. What you want to do is, in my case, all I want to do is fly. I didn't care about anything else. But as you get a little bit older and you have a chance to reflect, that 20 years that I spent in was the best job I ever had. And I would do it over again in that particular time frame. I'd do it over again 1,000 times.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not saying the military is better than some other job. I think the fact that they essentially have a process of breaking you down and building you up as a team. And I think that recipe could be successful in multiple industries. You just have to be willing to go through those first few tough weeks of breaking somebody down and getting them to realize, hey, you're going to be a lot better if you come together as a team.
Well, and I went on from my military career. I stayed here in Kodiak just because two of my boys were going into high school, and my wife's father actually was a coast. He retired as the commanding officer in Sitka during the Princeton Arm Rescue, actually. But they wanted to stay, so we sort of made a career choice to stay here in Kodiak. And after that, I look back, and without my military training and background, I wouldn't have been able to achieve the things I've done. I initially opened a franchise, mailboxes, etc. franchise is now the UPS store, and when we were going through training, they said, well, we're looking for advertising ideas. So I said, well, why don't you do an ad in Kodiak? Because if you can ship stuff from Kodiak, you can ship from anywhere. And I remember the guy said, no, that's a bad idea. So about 3 months later, they said, hey, we're coming to Kodiak. We're going to shoot a Super Bowl ad. So, within 2 years of getting out of the Coast Guard, I was on a Super Bowl commercial, 1977 Super Bowl commercial. It was Green Bay versus whoever they played. I know Green Bay won. And I was on a Super Bowl commercial. I mean, who would have thought that? Didn't even think about it. And then we ended up closing that business for a number of reasons. And I bought into a seafood business. And at the time I bought the seafood business, I didn't know a salmon from a blackcod. I just didn't. But I figured it out, and ultimately, grew the business to the point where we're producing millions of pounds of seafood a year. And it ultimately came down to just managing people and resources. Different people, different resources, different languages maybe, but it was just people and resources. So I took that military training of managing people and resources and adapted it to the civilian world, and it worked out fine.
One of my mentors, he said, Mike, nobody cares about what airplane you fly. What they care about is you understanding money and manpower. And so you saying people and resources, having the respect for people and understanding how important they are to the mission. We're in love with all these fancy airplanes and all these different exquisite weapon systems, but when it comes down to it, right. It's the people. It's the people. And so once again, we come from completely different military backgrounds, but we're both learning the same moral to the story here.
And I think if I had to say, somebody said, well, what is your strength as a leader? And I have master's degrees in leadership and management type stuff, but what is your strength? And you hit on it in the beginning, and I didn't really ever think of it in this way, but I know from feedback is that probably my focus as a leader has always been on taking care of my people. Always, and maybe to the exclusion of other things, but I always, whether the people I'm talking about were from El Salvador and spoke no English, or Filipino, in the case of the seafood industry, or people from the military from every walk of life, from Mobile, Alabama to wherever, southern guys or northern guys, western guys, but taking care of people, and I always felt that burden to do that, especially my crew. And I can't really tell why, but I just had a burden to take care of my crew, and it always paid dividends. And I didn't do it for that reason. That was just a benefit.
Jeff, you mentioned your rescue swimmer during that critical mission. How much of an interaction do you have? I imagine you guys just have an unbreakable click at this point.
Yeah.
From these experiences.
I stay in touch with him.
Communicate with Jeff?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I stay in touch with him a couple of times a month. He retired as an E8, as the most decorated rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard. As it turned out, he stayed in long enough to serve during Katrina. So if you remember seeing the Coast Guard doing rescues during Katrina, and you see guys hanging off the wires, swinging feet first into windows, that was him. He went in he rescued hundreds of people during Katrina. So he had a remarkable career. So yeah, we stay in touch. And funny story, we were in San Diego for another award show. We were down there for another award thing after the fisherman rescue, and we got our flight suits on. And Jeff is from Alabama, so he's a really strong accent. And I can't do it justice, so I won't. But we're standing in the elevator of this hotel with our flight suits on, and this little old lady comes in. I know I saw old ladies, but this little old lady comes in. She looks at both of us, and she goes, "Are you guys them Top Gun guys?" So Jeff said, "Why, yes, ma'am, we are." That's Jeff.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, I'm so glad you had those relationships, because I have friends that are struggling with PTSD, and I'm trying to figure out, is the PTSD from the experiences in the service, or does the PTSD kind of come from being separated from that purpose-driven life, and now you're out there trying to find something to fill that hole? And so what kind of advice do you have to folks that are just struggling to find that path when they take the uniform off?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, truthfully. I think the answer could be both. It just depends on when you notice that. But for me, when I think my first tour in New Orleans was, I did some great rescues in New Orleans, and it was fun. I was 23 years old, 24 years old. You're pretty well bulletproof in that thing. But then you get married and you have kids, and everything changes. Your whole perspective changes. But my first tour in Kodiak, because I had 2 tours, again, I flew a lot. I flew more than anybody, just because I would always be the first to raise my hand to go. And I love to fly. I was just probably an adrenaline junkie, I guess. I liked adventures. But in doing that, I flew in some of the worst conditions I've ever flown in my life. I never flew anything like that other than that rescue in Sitka. But, nighttime, pitch black, going with no nav aids, going through narrow mountain passes, no NVGs, no nothing, and just hoping you had turb feelers out because you hope you didn't hit anything. And did that all the time. And I remember coming back, sometimes my knees were just shaking. I was like, oh my God, I don't know how I was. In fact, I remember praying, going through those mountains and saying, oh God, just get me through this one more time. And I did that more times. And I think that probably changed me in a way that I'll never be the same. I would do it again, but I'll never be the same. I'm sure you've had instances in your career where you've had missions where you just like, oh God, I'm just glad to be back on the ground again. And I had more of those in Kodiak than any other tour I had. So fast forward to when I retired, nobody actually told me about VA benefits. I just got out, and the next day I started working my job. And it wasn't until 15 years later that one of my friends, Jeff, actually said, you should check on your VA benefits. And I said, nah, I'm busy, But he said, no, you need to check. So I did, and when I was up there in Anchorage and going through the American Legion Assistance Office, I remember the lady, talking about back and hearing and all those other things. And she says, how's your mental health? And I said, it's great. No, she's no, really, really, how's your, it's like knocking on the table, like, how's your mental health? I said, it's fine, And what she's really getting is that, do you want to talk about PTSD? And I said, no, I absolutely don't want to talk about anything like that. I said, I'm fine. Well, a couple of years later, and again, talked to some friends, they said, you sort of go checked. And I did. And the guy said, yeah, you have all the symptoms of PTSD. And I thought, what are you talking about? So part of that is realizing that you actually have a problem. And I always felt guilty because I had all my fingers and toes. I'd never been in a hospital. I'd never, I was intact physically. I didn't get shot at but one time my whole career. So I just thought, I don't qualify for the guys that have done that really dangerous stuff. But somebody told me, well, you went into the service and you came out differently than you went in, no matter what's your job. I don't care if you're somebody that refuels airplanes or somebody that's driving airplanes, it doesn't matter. You come out differently by the fact that you're in a high stress, demanding job, you travel all over the world, you do things differently, and there's a good chance that you're not the same as when you came in. So I'm really sorry. I'm so glad you asked this question, because now one of my missions right now is to talk to people about PTSD. And it's not a badge of honor, but it's not anything you should be ashamed of either. I mean, if you've got issues, and they all manifest differently, for me, and it's really when I realized I had a problem. I was testifying in front of a Senate subcommittee in Washington, D.C., in front of Senator Murkowski, and I was explaining to them why this village called King Cove, which is in the Alaska Peninsula, needed a road from their village to the nearest airport in Cold Bay, because they didn't have one, so they couldn't do medevacs, or they couldn't drive to a medevac. So the reason I was there is the short version is I went to find a plane crash, and I found 4 bodies in a plane they pancaked in the middle of a snowstorm, and they were literally seated in the seats. I mean, they were frozen in the seated position, so we had to wrench them out of there, stuff them in the back. There were legs and arms and a few spare parts all over the place in the helicopter. I remember looking back at it and thinking, gosh, I need to compartmentalize this. I need to get on with it. I've got the job to do. And so I was now, fast forward about 30 years, I was testifying in the Senate subcommittee, and I got to the part where I was describing, looking back at these legs and these arms, all over the place, and there was a spare leg rolling around because the guy got amputated leg, and I just choked up. And it took me about, 15 seconds to recompose myself. And in fact, I was sitting next to the environmental lady that was protesting this road, and I thought she was going to say, hey, you need a Kleenex. She just leaned over and said, that was just so emotional. That was when I knew that, hey, I didn't see that coming. I didn't know it was coming. I'd bottled it up for 30 years. I'd compartmentalized it like you do. And in my term in the Coast Guard, if you had an event like that, you just got on with it. If you would never think of saying anything to anybody, you're like, don't be a cupcake, just get on with it. And So I encourage people. I just gave a speech or a talk the other day at the Coast Guard base here in Kodiak, and I ended it by saying, if you please make sure you find a safe space where you can talk to people. And it might not be traumatic, it might be something insignificant, but make sure you're in an environment where you can go and talk to somebody and get help. Because if you had a broken hand, a broken leg as a pilot or air crew, they're going to send you to the doctor because they need you to be home. If you've got something going on with your mental health, don't you think that they've got a ton of money invested in you as an asset of the Air Force or the Coast Guard or whoever? Why would they throw you out? Why should they? And the Coast Guard's changing. They actually changed the Air Ops manual to now make it not punitive to go seek health. I think, boy, what a great environment. So I truly encourage people to do that, and because you owe it to yourself to do that.
That's one of the main reasons why I started Voice for Valor. Is I'm trying to give veterans a platform for them to be heard and understood.
Mm-hmm.
I had a very good friend introduce me to my wife, was a groomsman in my wedding, and he had to take somebody down in the line of duty as a police officer, and he never got over it. Mm-hmm. We had multiple conversations, and he just couldn't get over it. And so alcoholism eventually led to suicide. And when he took his life, I finally said to myself, I've got to do this. Mm-hmm. I've got to provide some sort of platform that people can just share stories.
Yeah.
Because every time I share my stories with others, I feel better.
Yeah.
I just feel a little bit better, just incrementally better every time I share stories with others that understand.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Sharing.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. And it's, it took me a long time. And so I'm hoping that, people that hear this, you won't wait so long, because I was, one, I didn't realize, and two, I didn't feel worthy. I mean, despite all the medals and awards and all other stuff, I didn't come back and spend 6 months in Walter Reed. I didn't. Or any of those other things. I didn't. And I probably felt guilty about saying, well, I don't deserve this. But the fact of the matter is, when you go through these situations, it changes you, and you have a right to get the help you need, and so never ever be ashamed of it, and just it'll make you a better person. And I'm just glad for the opportunity to talk about it.
Well, thank you, John. And before we close, you have 7 grandchildren.
I do.
What are you doing to leave your legacy with them?
Well, some of them are too young to care right now. And then I've got some teenagers that are teenagers, they don't care either. So, but I'm being facetious when I say that. What I do is I just go out of my way to stay in touch with them. They're all distant. They live on the East Coast. So, I just do everything I can to create and maintain a good relationship with them. And I got one boy who's 15 or 14. He'll be 15 next. And, we're going to go to Normandy together because he's really into military stuff. And so I just try to be grandpa. That's what I do.
Well, John, thank you so much for sharing those stories with us today. And next time you're in DC, I do want to meet up, and let's continue to talk about DFC and trying to get some of this new blood, these recent recipients, into your organization. How's that sound?
Hey, let's talk because I'd be more than glad to do it, and I'll be there in March, in DC in March.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care.